Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for calling in on this global webinar on the future geospatial ecosystem and more precisely, what is the role of UN-GGIM? Since its inception, UN-GGIM has kept abreast of future trends and opportunities in the application and the use of geospatial technologies. And we have developed the necessary global policy to assist countries in making change where it will benefit the most. This has been greatly assisted by the 3 editions of the report titled Future Trends in Global Geospatial Information Management, as led by Ordnance Survey. But the pace of change is rapidly accelerating, as is our geospatial landscape. Technological developments and innovations, what many call the 4th industrial revolution, are disrupting traditional methods of geospatial data delivery and dissemination. They make us think differently, to look beyond data as a focal point of activity and consider processing and synthesizing data into contextualized information so that it can be readily used to gain new knowledge, insights, and impact through a variety of means and by a much wider group of users. In essence, we are being challenged to look into the global crystal ball towards a landscape that comprises digital ecosystems, of which the geospatial ecosystem is one part, but an important part. As many of you will be aware, the concept of a future geospatial ecosystem was discussed at length by the UN-GGIM Committee of Experts at its 12th session in August 22 and included a side event that initiated the first debate. And it was a debate. In the decision 12-102, our committee acknowledged that it was a timely and strategically important topic to consider, but called for greater understanding and clarity on how the future ecosystem would link to the work UN-GGIM has already carried out, including the UN-IGIF, as a solid base for the future geospatial ecosystem. Subsequent discussions in various fora have raised more questions than answers. In some circles of our community, discussions have urged UN-GGIM to take a proactive role in shaping aspects of the future geospatial ecosystem. Others have urged a more passive approach, that the ecosystem will evolve naturally and take care of itself without or with our inputs. What it is to be. Today, with this seminar, we will discuss what the role is of UN-GGIM in the future geospatial ecosystem. And we will look for some kind of consensus or position that we may take as we prepare to discuss this item more at our upcoming 13th session of UN-GGIM in New York in August. To do so, we will first have a presentation from Dr. Leslie Arnold to set the scene and help us understand what the future geospatial ecosystem may look like. Responding to Leslie are several leaders from our global geospatial community, and I will introduce them briefly later. I also have a few primer questions prepared for them to respond as well. But first, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Leslie Arnold. Of course, this is not a one-way webinar, and we are really looking forward to your questions. And the best way is to put them in our chat so we can ask them to our distinguished panel later on. So, Leslie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you for the introduction. Today, firstly, Ingrid, may I ask if you can see my screen?
Yes, Leslie, I see it, but still in, now it's in presenter mode. Now it's good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes. It's an easy thing to do. Okay, so today I'd like to touch on some of the work that's been progressing with some of the committees and describe what it is to move from a spatial data infrastructure towards this future ecosystem. So thank you very much. And the idea today is to set the scene for the panel discussion, which is where the exciting conversation will begin. But first, for me, I'm going to talk about what we are trying to achieve, why we can't achieve it at the moment, and what that transformation to a new ecosystem might look like, and also what we need to consider. So firstly, what are we trying to achieve? So when we think about it, at the moment with our spatial data infrastructures, we're being able to deliver data and information. And it's very clear from the workshops that we've had that we want to move beyond data and information to try and deliver knowledge to people. And if people use that knowledge, then the notion is that they're gaining new insights from that knowledge that they couldn't actually achieve with data and information. What we haven't appreciated yet is really how we're going to deliver that knowledge. What does that knowledge look like to people? Who is it for? And how they're actually going to use that information. Where are they going to use the information? And when they do use that information, how will they know they can trust that information? And of course, this comes back to us as a community thinking about those questions and how we will evolve this ecosystem to answer some of those questions where we're delivering knowledge and not just data and information. Through the workshops, we've identified 3 drivers. They keep coming up on all the time, where technology is the enabler here for these drivers. So if I just touch firstly on the first one, with our spatial data infrastructures, we're able to use those to access information, to be able to process that information, to be able to respond to local and national challenges. But what we're not doing is participating in global solutions to some of the challenges we have. And we have many challenges in common as different nations. So how do we harness that information from this local to global level? And when you think of it, we've got a lot of things in common between all our countries. The pandemic preparedness is an obvious one. And so, of course, is migration and migration of refugees. Some other things that are now we're seeing is this deep sea mining, and there's a bit of a moratorium on deep sea mining for some countries because countries nearby don't quite understand the impacts. And also emerging climate geoengineering, how one country responds to climate change using engineering methods, and how does that affect us in another country. So we have some significant challenges coming up where we will need data from all countries and being able to access that in a global sense. The second driver was our society. Our society is expecting knowledge on demand. Everything has to happen quickly. We're in this bit of a revolution now. But not only do people want answers straight away, they want that answers delivered in terms of their context. So in terms of their preferences. And so how do we deliver that knowledge and do it very quickly and deliver it in a way that it's for a general user, not a professional user? The complexity, of course, that we have is that knowledge does need to be individualised. So people have similar questions about data, and there's an example here. Will this property be flooded? It's the same question for many groups, but if you're an emergency responder, you're looking for a different answer. So how do we think about who we're delivering this knowledge to? Emergency responder wants to know if they need to start evacuating a particular area. A home buyer wants to know if they might need to reevaluate buying a property. An insurance broker, they want to know what their risks are if they insure a particular property, and an urban planner wants to avoid building in an area that's subject to flooding. The third driver is about bridging the digital, geospatial digital divide. And so whatever we do, the challenge here is to design an ecosystem that's going to be accessible to all. We do acknowledge that countries are still developing their spatial data infrastructures. So how do we find mechanisms to actually deliver knowledge more easily when we consider that it's just as hard at the moment to deliver access to data? So the design of our system needs to consider developing nations as well as developed nations. That knowledge needs to be accessible to everyone. The system that we develop needs to be equitable. And so if we do that, we need to think about the Kenyan farmer. How much fertilizer and where is quite often the question that they have. Fertilizer costs a lot of money. So how do we answer these questions? And we need to put these questions in a way that is on a cheap and accessible infrastructure. The geoanalytics need to be able to understand the Kenyan farmers' individual needs. It needs to consider where the globally accessible data is, and it needs to consider how the answers are portrayed. And again, this comes back to having confidence in the answers. So here, how much fertilizer should they purchase and where should it be put? So why can't we achieve this knowledge now, and why do we need to change? Well, firstly, if you think about our current spatial data infrastructures, we are sharing data. They allow us to do that. So people are using our data. Our data can be integrated with other people's data. We know that we can repurpose and reuse that information. We also know that we've developed analytics to process that data, and that analytics is delivering knowledge. We also have applications being built, and those applications are enabling us to make decisions and set policy. And we also know from the socioeconomic studies that are being developed that benefits are accruing. So the question is, why do we need to change? What we also know, though, and there's been some studies, and UN-GGIM have been developing papers, and so as the futures papers work that have been done as well, highlight that our spatial data infrastructures have some limitations. And firstly, that's because the data is human accessible. It's not necessarily machine readable. SDIs, we're pushing data out, but we're not necessarily delivering answers. The SDIs are for professional users, and it means that the general users don't really, whilst they have access to data, don't really know how to use it, because there's a delay in knowledge while you actually have to process that data in order to get an answer. There's also limited integration. When you think about the data, data that's stored in an SDI is not able to be integrated with things like Twitter feeds and other social network data. And also, this essentially is limiting opportunity. And what we've really done is we've built some data catalogs where we've put our information, but essentially we put it into a cupboard that's only accessible by a human. What we're trying to get to is where people, and in this case, I'm showing an example of a scientist, can actually trawl through information and get answers immediately. So if you're a scientist and you've identified a hypothesis, it may be a combination of 3 elements, and you want to understand what other information out there is also recognise those 3 elements. At the moment, you would need to sit for weeks and weeks on Google to actually trawl through the research catalogues and articles to find information to try and actually see if your hypothesis has been noted anywhere else. And so ideally, what we want to do is send out a bit of an algorithm that actually searches the web of data and finds that information. And of course, we want it to find information in our SDI portals as well. ChatGPT, everyone's talking about it, works on this principle. You fire up a question and off it goes, searching the web. Of course, when it gets to our SDI portals, the data then becomes human readable, and it's not accessible to things like ChatGPT, and it's not accessible to virtual assistants such as Siri, Cortana and Alexis. So the next stage for us in our progression from our spatial data infrastructures is to actually start thinking about how we open up access to those SDI portals. And if you like, this is our Narnia moment where we need to open up the cupboard and allow the data to be accessible by a machine. To do that, the principle, the standard, the principle is, of course, to make data fair. Now, we might think our data is fair in an SDI catalogue. It is findable. We know we can access it. We know that it's interoperable because we follow standards, and we can reuse our data in a number of ways. But really, when we think of fair in its true sense, fair means that data is machine readable, and again, the SDIs are human readable. But having that data machine readable is only one aspect, and it gets complicated here. So we need to teach our machines to actually think like us as well. So if you think, and let's use the example, ChatGPT or Siri, we're asking a question of Siri. That question requires the location of data to answer that question. That data needs to be interpreted, and there's a lot of concepts and relationships within that data that need to be understood in order to process it, which is the next step. And of course, we know how to process our data. There's a series of steps you have to go through, buffer, overlay the data to actually deliver a result. And so that's a lot to ask a computer to do, particularly if at the end of it, we have to communicate how reliable that answer is to our user. But not all is lost, because there is a lot of research being going on, particularly around natural language processing for interpreting questions. Some spatial filtering and semantic search in terms of finding data. There's ontologies and data vocabularies that help us understand data, and machines understand the data. And there's processes that have been developed, and of course W3C and others are developing standards for presenting that information to the user. And it's all quite iterative. If you think of natural language processing, if the question has a where in it, so where is something, that actually gives an indication of how that information should be presented back to the user. Where usually indicates a location, which potentially indicates a map. Whereas how far, you're looking for essentially a textual response in a distance. So they all work together, these concepts, and together they're called artificial intelligence and semantic web ontologies. And I'm going to actually talk about them. Okay, so what will the transformation look like? So before we go any further, I just want to clarify between what is an infrastructure and what is an ecosystem. When we talk about an infrastructure, it's something that we build. Both have got policies, the need for capacity in education, communication, partnerships, all of those things we talk about at the UN in terms of the IGIF. They're still all important. The difference is that an infrastructure we purposely build, and an ecosystem is something that evolves over time as we continually add to it bit by bit. So there's a couple of other things I want to talk about too before I go on. And the first thing is that we are on a journey with our advancements in geospatial. There are countries who are still currently using paper-based products. They're doing a lot of digitizing to capture that information. And there's a lot of work still being done in the to develop our spatial data infrastructures. There's a lot of work and thinking going on about the spatial knowledge infrastructure, or the GKI, and that's developing systems of systems, and that's bringing in a lot more to do with the private sector as well as the government sector here. And then we have the ecosystem. I've got a question mark there. The question is, do we name it, this ecosystem? For now, in this conversation, we'll call it the geospatial information ecosystem. And of course, this is an ecosystem that permits intelligent interactions between data and services. Now, so I'm just going to talk about these elements here, but recognizing that every country has a different starting point. But today, we're just going to focus on SDIs, the GKI, and the ecosystem. The other thing I need to explain too is about this continuum, or the evolution of the web. So we first started out with Web 1.0, and you don't hear of it anymore. It's where the web pages were only read-only. Then we move to the social web, which is the Facebook age, if you like. And this is where our spatial data infrastructures came of age. This enabled us to read and write or upload and download information on the web. Now we're in a stage where it's called the semantic web, and this is where the web is now transformed into a global database. It means we can both upload and download information, but we can also run processes on that web of data. And this is an important point for our transition. Then we have Web 4.0, which has got very different names. I'm using the name, the spatial web here. The spatial web was built on top of the semantic web. It uses the semantic web, but now it's progressing to involve more seamless integration between these convergent technologies, the physical technologies, the autonomous vehicles and the virtual headsets and all the 4IR technologies. And it's this combination of that physical and digital world where we soon won't quite know what that difference is. It will merge seamlessly. The key thing here, and I want to stress, is there's no hard and fast divider between these webs. The categorization is there, but the boundaries are really a little bit blurred. But nonetheless, this is the continuum. As we continue with our geospatial, we are also continuing with this web. The other aspect is this artificial intelligence. Now, I haven't put an arrow here because I don't really want to show this as a continuum when all these elements of AI are developing at the same time. And we've started with, fuzzy logic and Bayesian modeling, and that's all part of AI. But here I just want to say that there's some key ones here: natural language processing, machine learning, computer vision, perception, and generative models. The one we really use in geospatial is the machine learning. We've done this well. We're still developing in this area, creating deeper learning models. This is all about data capture, and now we need to think a bit more about natural language processing and how questions are interpreted for geospatial in order to initiate that question and answer process I mentioned earlier. And also generative models, which is which I'll talk a bit about now. So with a generative AI, you're thinking ChatGPT here. We can ask it a question and off it goes answering, looking for information. And it simply takes the information and puts it back to you in a different form. So it's not creating new information, it's learning from the information that's out there and delivering it in a different way, being it a summarized information, a report or a poem. There's also other applications out there to do with art, creating music, and there's even one there called GAN, terrain generation modeling, that can create a map, a 3D map of cities. So how do we bring all this together? Just a moment. So let's look at spatial data infrastructures in terms of the web. And our spatial data infrastructure, just down the bottom there, it's providing access to data. It's providing access to APIs. The difference with the web is that it's bidirectional. There is typically a provider or a host hosting the data. In this essence, the SDI is a host for data. One of the things about the web 2.0 is that it's not as secure as the future web. We have put in place things like passwords and protocols that enable our data to be safe, and there's a lot of workarounds. But it is bidirectional. If you think about your email, every time I send an email, my provider has a copy of that information. So it's not as secure because it does have to go through another party. The next stage we simply talk about is moving to the systems of systems, and this is again what I feel is the GKI. We're starting to create knowledge because we're combining systems. All those systems can access data from our spatial data infrastructure because we organize that data, and we can use it and combine it in different ways and build applications on top of that data to service particular needs, such as smart cities, and smart utilities. Intelligent transport systems come to mind. we're developing digital twins. Digital twins are making that data meaningful, because we can actually start doing some scenarios modeling to a more granular degree. So where to next? And this is where we're bringing in Web 3.0. So Web 3.0, and you'll notice there just along the bottom that the SDI participates in all these aspects. I just want to say, we don't throw out spatial data infrastructures. They're actually necessary. We still need our data organized and accessible. We're just saying it's machine accessible. And whether we're doing a digital twin or any other data, that data to be usable in a Web 3.0 environment, it needs to be machine readable, because this is where we're moving from a human readable environment to a machine readable environment. And so the point of the paradigm shift is here, human readable and machine readable. So if we think of the web of data, this is where the AI is operating within, and the web of data is actually made up of a number of ecosystems, and we don't typically think of them like that, but they're all very focused on particular niches. So Wikipedia is an encyclopedia, but it has this whole graph system that connects information, and it is essentially an ecosystem. Same with the marketing. If you think of Google, again, it's creating all these knowledge graphs. If I search something, I get a message back saying, people who have searched on this also search on that. And so I know that this information is being traced, and they're building up this knowledge graph every time one of us searches data. So these are linkages. Digital libraries are being done extensively now. Digital libraries across the globe are linking to each other. They are quite suited to this, because of course they've got bibliographies, and those bibliographies are able to be interlinked. The health sector is also using linked data as well, and they've created quite a ecosystem around research data related to the health sciences. And same with accommodation. If you think of hotels.com and Airbnb, they're all ecosystems of information about something. The same with the education, and of course the metaverse. And we've all heard of the metaverse, and again, it's an ecosystem initially developed for the gaming and virtual reality, but of course it is extending as well. So where does the geospatial system fit into this? Look, just like we have fundamental data things that have a need in a number of different application areas, we're noting that all these areas also use geospatial information. So I put it across the others. We've got digital twins being used in the metaverse. We've got accommodation maps being used in, maps being used in the accommodation ecosystem, and same as the health. So, so geospatial ecosystem potentially, and I'm not talking about data, I'm talking about geoanalytics, I'm talking about the rules around geospatial, all potentially can interrelate to make other areas or other ecosystems much more useful, knowledgeable, in enabling linking, because everything links to a place. So what's next? So it's hard to know how to take a step forward, but the UN-GGIM has done a lot already. The countries have worked together to develop a framework for strengthening geospatial information. You may be familiar with this framework. It has 3 focus areas: governance, technology and people, and then 9 strategic pathways. And there are 4 elements within each pathway to help think, to help us plan to move and strengthen our information. This framework is now being rolled out across the globe, but it also can be used as a step change to address some of these drivers for change as well. And these are the 3 that I mentioned earlier. This will help, if you're in thinking about all these areas, help us to actually take a bit of control of our journey, because it's really hard to think about what we need to do in a number of areas. And I'm going to lead the panel, who I'm sure will discuss a number of these aspects. I just want to choose two, if I have time. I just look at my time. I do. Just to the areas that I haven't touched on at the moment. And one is thinking about new business models, because this is an opportunity for countries. And if countries are questioning why move to a new ecosystem, there are significant opportunities in making data machine readable. And that is the step change for countries, is simply to make the SDI data machine readable. And the other one is this by-partnerships. When you think about the Web 3.0, it is multimodal. So by that I mean is you don't have to go through a provider. So many of us have a camera system at home, not many of us, some of us, and not me, to say. And that's linked directly to our phone. So it doesn't have to go through a third party. So the camera is actually talking to my phone. And this is what it means by being multimodal. And it offers up significant opportunities for us for the future, if you think of the transactions being peer-to-peer. So this is moving beyond the sale of data through to knowledge on demand services. It's also being enabled because in Web 3.0 we're seeing advancements in how we manage our digital identity. Transactions are becoming much more secure with things like blockchain, and we're also seeing that we've got things like digital rights management that allows us to have more ownership or more secure ownership out of the content that we create. Now, there are a number of future models. I've put 4 up here. One is these decentralized apps. Again, no intermediary. They're simply built on blockchain. And Georgia has got a good example of how they're using blockchain in their land administration processes. There's also this what's called a tokenized economy, and it's simply using digital tokens, and they're used for trading. They do relate to money, but they don't necessarily relate to money. That these tokens can be exchanged between 2 peers. So it could be a government agency and a company, or it could be a government agency and an individual. The other one is these marketplaces, where again you can do transactions without any intermediaries, and these content platforms, again, where the user pays direct access again to a provider or a supplier, again, without having to go necessarily through an intermediary. And by that I mean things like eBay, Amazon. So that opens up a lot of opportunities. One of the issues for national mapping agencies is that they want to open up access to data, but actually, in fact, they actually want to make it open and accessible to NGOs, citizens, but sometimes not necessarily to private enterprises, particularly mining companies who are going to use their imagery, make a lot of money. So they may actually, so this way you can actually decide who actually has to pay for your data and who doesn't, in a much more simplified way. The other area is this policy and legal framework. Now we're introducing AI. It's complicating the whole process. There's a lot of bad press around AI, and there's also a lot of good press, and there's a lot of work being done. The geospatial community is talking about this. I won't talk about that other than to say that there are frameworks being developed. National governments already are looking at ethics and privacy, security, and how AI is impacting society. Australia's just brought out a policy in that area. International organisations such as OECD are also developing frameworks that the geospatial community can use as a guide. So we're not actually starting from scratch here. There are partners we can work with to develop policies that will suit the geospatial sector. There's a new one, the Global Partnership on AI, or GPAI. They've actually started a global organisation that is establishing cooperation between a number of countries, and there's a lot of projects there that are being funded to look at the issues around AI. Interestingly, though, at the moment there's none on geospatial information, so they're a partner that needs to be considered. Regulatory agencies, again, looking at transparency, data privacy, competition, and so forth, and research institutions are looking at and advocating for responsible AI. And then, of course, the civil society and NGOs are looking at it from a human rights, fairness and ethical perspective. So there are works that are being done in a number of those 9 areas in the IGIF that can be explored. So my final takeaway, and it's a book by Sherman Voshmere, and she, in her opening chapter of her book, Token Economy, it just struck me. She talks about Web 2.0 being a front-end evolution, and that the Web 3.0 is a back-end revolution. And it got me thinking that, yes, our spatial data infrastructures are the front-end evolution. We think about it front-facing to people, and it's about data as such, and we've looked at how we can make that data accessible, and that won't change. Those spatial data infrastructures are being developed. They are necessary and they're part of the journey, and they are a necessary step for countries to take. That's the important part, but they won't change necessarily for the users. It won't change how we access information. And so this back-end evolution, these analytics and how we process data in this ecosystem will enable us to make that change and work towards how the average user can manage. In all of this, there's a whole lot of education to consider and a whole lot of research. And I guess that's pathway 8 of the IGIF, and a number of other considerations there for us to think about. Okay, so I've talked a lot and I've given a lot of information, and I will pause there and hand it back to Ingrid, to the panel. Thank you.
Leslie, thank you very much. I am very clear and good overview of all the issues that we have to face, and I will now open up the discussion. And the first person I would like to give the floor to is Paloma Merodio, who is a co-chair on UN-GGIM, and she's from the Mexican Institute for Statistics and Geoinformation. And what I would like to know from you is, how do you feel? Should UN-GGIM take an active role in assisting countries to define this future geospatial ecosystem? And if so, what role would we see there?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and thank you, Ingrid, Leslie. I'm very pleased to be here and to see so many people connected, and I see so many colleagues and friends that are in this session, and also thinking that if we're here, it means that we're discussing the topics for our next meeting in August. So we're preparing to meet all in person, so that is very, very good, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in New York. But in the meantime, I would like to try to address the question that you just posted, Ingrid, in terms of how UN-GGIM can support this work. So all of you know that UN-GGIM supports capacity building initiatives by providing training, technical assistance, and knowledge sharing among member states. It also helps countries develop their geospatial capabilities, strengthen institutions, and improve the collection management of geospatial information. UN-GGIM also promotes the sharing and integration of geospatial data at various levels, including local, regional, and global. And of course, it encourages member states to adopt open data policies, establish data sharing mechanisms, and collaborate on data collection efforts. So all of this is very much related to what Leslie just told us. So this facilitates the creation of comprehensive and up-to-date geospatial datasets that can be utilized for informed decision making. Also, the committee contributes to advancing the future geospatial ecosystem by fostering collaboration. And this is a very important slide that Leslie just showed us about what other institutions and organizations are doing with this respect. And knowledge sharing and coordinating efforts among member states would be one of the priorities in this sense. So it helps ensure that geospatial information and technologies that to be effectively utilized for addressing societal changes, promoting sustainable development, and achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, that we don't need to forget that this is our priority, to reduce poverty, to help that farmer in Kenya that Leslie just talked about. So bridging the geospatial divide between developed and developing countries requires the implementation of comprehensive strategies that address both the technological aspects and also the socio-economic challenges. And in order to bridge the digital divide between countries, it is essential to encourage the openness and sharing of geospatial data. So governments and institutions can establish open data policies and practices that allow free and open access to geospatial information. This will facilitate availability of up-to-date quality data for use in geospatial application and analysis. So developed countries can provide technical assistance and collaboration to developing countries in terms of technology, knowledge, and experience. And this is precisely what I like about UN-GGIM, that is the work is driven by member states, and member states should address what they may include and what they want to work on. So in knowledge sharing programs, collaboration, and on joint geospatial projects and establishment of strategic partners of geospatial development. So it is important to strengthen local capacities in developing countries so that we can effectively manage and use geospatial information. So how do we really talk to the local leaders and the mayors that this is important and that geospatial information can help to address the global challenges? So this can be achieved, of course, by training local professionals and promoting community participation in the management and use of geospatial data. So raising awareness of the importance of geospatial information and its applications can help generate greater interest and commitment in developing countries. So we also need to raise awareness and have advocacy campaigns that can highlight the benefits of geospatial information for sustainable development. So the answer to your question, Ingrid, is yes. How do we do it is the challenge, and how do we get all the financial resources that we need as a committee to really help address and implement this ecosystem in developing countries. So I really think that the answer has also to be with the linkages to the IGIF and the work that has been done to implement the IGIF in countries. And I guess that goes to someone else in the panel, this question, but I wanted to address also how Leslie mentioned several of the pathways along her presentation and how we can link the work that we are already doing due to limited resources in order to implement and advance in the future geospatial ecosystem to foster collaboration among member states. So I will leave it there, Ingrid, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Paloma. I think, thank you very much. I think you made some very relevant remarks how the role of UN-GGIM is to encourage openness, to support developing countries, and to raise awareness. Maybe Deidre, I'll give a question out to Deidre Bishop, who's the co-chair of the high-level group on the IGIF. Paloma mentioned the IGIF as a framework which we have been developing within a UN-GGIM, and in the high-level group of IGIF, you are witnessing the increasing experience derived from implementation of this framework and how countries are now moving forward in their national geospatial awareness and aspirations and capabilities. And last year, the Committee of Experts suggested that we reflect on our existing work, especially and specifically the IGIF, so this could serve as a solid base for the future geospatial ecosystem. Do you see a role for the IGIF in the future geospatial ecosystem? And if you do, what might that role be? Can you enlighten us on that, please?
Thank you, Ingrid. I most certainly do see a role for the UN-IGIF in the future geospatial information ecosystem. As we heard today from Leslie, from yourself, from Paloma, the geospatial information ecosystem includes an environment of components that interact with one another, contributing to the management and dissemination of geospatial information. Some of those components include policies, technology, and stakeholders. The UN-IGIF is a framework that may be used to develop or enhance that interconnected network of components. The UN-IGIF framework has been globally developed and endorsed by the UN-GGIM Committee of Experts. As Leslie showed on her slide presentation, the framework is comprised of 3 primary areas, including 9 total pathways. The 3 areas include first, governance, with governance, policy, and legal and financial pathways. The second area is technology, which includes the data, the innovation, and the standards pathways. And the third area is people, which includes the partnerships, the capacity and education, and communication and engagement pathways. These 9 pathways are the foundational elements of a strong geospatial information ecosystem. Countries may use the UN-IGIF overarching strategic framework and the IGIF implementation guide to implement and strengthen their geospatial information management practices. The implementation guide provides a roadmap by sharing specific guidance, options, and actions that member states may take. This roadmap, in turn, helps guide important decisions as countries develop action plans to implement the IGIF. One of the important goals of the high-level group of the IGIF is to translate the IGIF documentation that's online now into languages beyond English. Our member states have volunteered their time to help translate the documents into Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Arabic, and those translations are occurring now. Once countries have implemented the pathways and strengthened their geospatial information management practices, they can begin to integrate these foundational elements with other elements of the digital ecosystem. Remember, Leslie told us geospatial is a key integrator of the digital fabric. So what type of data can we integrate our geospatial information with? Data that's collected by governments, academic institutions, and private companies. For example, censuses and surveys, scientific results, and retail order statistics. Data that's derived from internet-based information, such as social media and websites through APIs and web scraping. Earth observations from satellites, including the use of machine learning to identify change on the landscape, and sensor data about traffic conditions. Integrating across the digital ecosystem will thereby enable better reporting, visualization, and problem solving related to our most pressing national and global challenges, including national security, health security, climate change and biodiversity loss, digital equity, and migration. This integration will help drive toward change. This will become even more effective if our member states are using a globally endorsed framework like the UN-GGIF. Not only does the UN-GGIF promote the development of foundational geospatial elements that are necessary and focus on governance, technology, and people, but the UN-GGIF promotes international cooperation, partnerships, and knowledge exchange among our member states and stakeholders. We learn from each other. With all that said, and in answer to your question, I do believe that the IGIF has a very important role to play in the future geospatial information ecosystem. During the 13th session of the upcoming UN-GGIM Committee of Experts, we will be holding a forum about the IGIF on Tuesday, August 1st, beginning at 1 p.m. in Conference Room 3, and we would like to invite you all to attend and learn more. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you, Deidre. And I saw some questions, very specific questions in the chat about how many countries have already implemented or are implementing the IGIF. I think all that information will be shared in this seminar. I don't know if you have a ready answer here and now, but sure we can find that information also about the lessons learned. I think this is maybe we can, if we have time at the end of the session, we can get back to that question. But if not, this seminar is certainly an interesting place where you can learn about that all. So thank you very much, Deidre, for your answer to my question. And I will move on to Mr. David Henderson, who is Vice Chair of UN-GGIM Europe. David, you and your colleagues from Ordnance Survey have been a key contributor to this topic. And in considering if we should take a proactive role or a more passive approach, what do you think are the risks we should consider as we position the work and vision of UN-GGIM for the future geospatial ecosystem?
Well, thank you, Ingrid. Just checking you can hear me okay?
You're fine,
yeah.
Thanks.
Great. So thank you, Ingrid. Thank you very much, Leslie. And I hope to build just maybe a little bit on the encouraging remarks of both Paloma and Deirdre. Firstly, this is really important. I think we talked about this last year in New York, and some of us have engaged in conversations, perhaps over many years, about how the landscape, the developments that happen around the work of UN-GGIM needs to continue to shape and influence on our work. I think that for me, the work that Leslie's presented has two really important roles to play. One is, and I applaud Leslie in just 30 minutes for just how much information she was able to share with us. It's really not easy to do that. And I think when I look back over perhaps 3 iterations of the reports that we authored around future trends influencing the global geospatial information framework and our work, I begin to see now so many of those trends coming together to, if you like, define the ecosystem that Leslie is sharing with us. So I think to inform our understanding of these new trends is really important, really relevant, and I'm grateful to Leslie for doing that. I think also there is something really important about creating a platform for discussion and debate amongst ourselves as a committee of experts, because I think increasingly it is about how we choose to collaborate, who we choose to collaborate with, and how we ensure that the impact of our work is greater than the sum of our parts. And I think that's really important to continue to consider going forward. So I think the work that Leslie is providing for us and the discussion that we're having is really important. I think I would just observe that the work of UN-GGIM, indeed the IGF as a sort of principal platform for our work, always sits in amongst the changing world. Many of the things that Paloma and Deirdre talked about were sort of referencing, if you like, the ever-changing environment in which we are increasingly working, whether that's technological change, our ways of working. Let us not forget that we couldn't even have such online debates such as this even just maybe 2 or 3 years ago. This is new ways of working for us all. But importantly, the context in which we're contributing to something impactful is something which I think is really important. I'll come back to that perhaps in my closing remarks. So Ingrid, you asked me, I guess, 2 questions in particular. One, should we take a proactive role or a passive approach? And secondly, what risks we should be considering as we position the work and the vision of UN-GGIM in the future geospatial ecosystem. The first question is really simple for me. Should we take a proactive role or a passive approach? If you forgive me, I might not choose those 2 words specifically, but I think it is definitely very important indeed. I think we cannot afford to ignore the development of the ecosystem in which our work is likely to have value, and therefore it is absolutely the right conversation for us to be having, and we should continue to have it. Secondly, in the form of risk, I'm just going to perhaps mention 3 areas of risk that I think is relevant to me, and perhaps that I'd encourage us to continue to talk about. Firstly is the perception, if you like, that there is indeed a single ecosystem. I struggle with that personally, perhaps, and just encourage us to think that perhaps the ecosystem is something that grows and continues to evolve, and is therefore by its very nature quite difficult to define. And I don't think we should perhaps lose too much sleep, if I can use that English, over the need to define it. Ecosystems are by their very nature complex, they're perhaps nebulous, and they're not very easily defined. But it is important that we have a sense as to what our external environment looks like for sure. I think all of the speakers so far have noted the context that as we move from data towards knowledge and wisdom, we need to acknowledge that we cannot get to knowledge and wisdom solely from within the geospatial community. I think probably most of us have sat over 10 years discussing whether geospatial is mainstream or not, and so on and so forth. But I think it's really important to note that this is now bigger than the geospatial community, and this creates opportunity from us. So we will need to consider how to bring expertise from other sectors, from other domains, into what is essentially a system of systems. The concept that we're talking about should be captured and explored in discussion. Otherwise, there's the risk of disconnect between data producers and data consumers, and that extends into the future geospatial ecosystem, running the risk of being solutions driven rather than user driven. So I think that's a really important point for me, and that we seek to respond primarily to the needs of our users. I think the final challenge or risk for me is that the future geospatial information ecosystem will be greatly influenced by the world around us, as it should be. The discussions mature, it will be useful to consider how geospatial data and technologies can enable the global community to overcome challenges the world is facing and embrace the opportunities that arise. And if I look perhaps back over the last 15 years or so, the challenges that we're facing today may have accelerated in some way, but there are some very new challenges that are of particular topic and should be of particular focus for UN-GGIM today. So I guess in sort of closing remarks, I worked with someone a while ago who used to distinguish between data as infrastructure and the infrastructure of data. And whilst at the time I used to really benefit from that distinction in my own thinking, I think today within UN-GGIM, we rightly focus our effort on how we best provision data as infrastructure which can be relied upon, that is trustworthy and authoritative. And I think the work, our focus for me, needs to continue to focus on data as infrastructure. However, rather than think about the infrastructure of data, I increasingly think about the ecosystem in which value can be realized. And I think that ecosystem is far bigger than that of GGIM. It's far bigger than just geospatial. But I think the challenge for us, and the debate that I would certainly welcome us continuing to have, is how we ensure that our valuable work plays a critical role in the evolution of that global ecosystem as it evolves going forward, whether it's labelled as geospatial or broader of that. I believe that it's certainly very important for us to continue to connect with it. Thank you, Ingrid.
Okay, thank you, David. A lot of things to think about. I will now shift to Africa, and I would like to give the floor to Ms. Marola Mimi Chauke, who is the chair of UN-GGIM Africa. Hi, Mimi.
Hi.
I hope you are fine. The committee of experts has repeatedly said or specified the need to reduce the growing geospatial digital divide and to ensure that any consideration of the future ecosystem also prioritizes the circumstances of developing countries. In your view, is the future geospatial ecosystem going to benefit or hinder developing countries in reducing this growing geospatial digital divide? And what can we do to prioritize the needs of the developing countries?
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Ingrid. And greetings from the freezing South Africa. And I think I'll acknowledge the previous speakers in terms of the contributions that they have made. And in answering your question, I think I'll answer it in two parts. One, the future geospatial ecosystem has the potential to benefit developing countries in reducing the geospatial divide. That's one part. But equally, it has the potential to hinder developing countries in reducing the geospatial divide. Now, if we want to address the benefit, we have to also look at the response given now by David in terms of the role of the UN-GGIM and the approach that should be taken by the UN-GGIM. If the UN-GGIM decide to take a proactive role, then we are able to work towards reducing the geospatial divide. But if the UN-GGIM decide to take the passive role, we are working against that objective. Now, let's talk about the benefits of geospatial data. We all know about the power of geospatial data, and because everything happens somewhere. We also heard about how geospatial information can assist the Kenyan farmer in determining the amount of fertilizer to put in, the water to be used in agriculture. We know about geospatial data in terms of disaster management and response, geospatial data in electrifying our rural spaces, geospatial information so the list goes on and on and on. Now, should the developing countries embrace the geospatial ecosystem, as I have mentioned these cases, we have a lot of developing countries now, advancing the use of geospatial technologies and therefore reducing the geospatial divide. The more we have of developing countries using geospatial information and technologies, the more we can start, reducing the geospatial divide. Now, let's go back to the negative, where the future geospatial ecosystem can hinder. And this is a discussion because we're looking at the real picture, the existing picture. A lot of developing countries have unique challenges, and these challenges relate to issues of access to data and technology and issues of capacity. How do we build the necessary skills and expertise to efficiently utilize geospatial technologies to support delivery of national developmental agendas? We have issues of data availability. Even in cases where there's open data, data can be available but might not be of good quality or accurate to be used. And the issue of infrastructure, some countries struggle with internet connectivity. Some countries don't even have electricity. And the issue of cloud-based geospatial tools is still not yet on the table for discussion. The issue of real-time geospatial data analysis is also not on the table. Now, if the UN-GGIM take the position to be proactive on this matter, this is what we can realize. And I take note from what other speakers have said, that we need to build a geospatial ecosystem that belongs to all. And to do that, maybe a proposal, and I'm coming now to the last part of your question to say, how do we address those needs? The first, I think, approach is to look at a readiness assessment for developing countries. We need to understand where these developing countries are and also build some kind of intervention plans to say that you as a developing country, you are at level 1, and then for us to move you from level 1 to 5, of course, with this capacity building support and all that, you need to have all this in place. So that's one. This should, and the intervention plan will use frameworks like the integrated geospatial information framework. We've got a beautiful framework that can be used to start building intervention plans. Now, there are other issues, elements that must come into, the needs, which are infrastructure development, capacity building, data availability, localization, and others. And I'm happy that Paloma indicated the role of the UN-GGIM in supporting this initiative, which includes capacity building, knowledge sharing, strengthening institutions. So there's a positive in terms if we take a proactive role as UN-GGIM, and therefore that can lead to reducing the geospatial digital divide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mimi, for your insights. I will move on now to Joe Blecha, who is market manager from Trimble. And Joe, first, thank you for stepping in to contribute to this discussion at such a short notice. And rather than a specific question, you've heard a lot of the comments of the speakers before you, and Leslie Arnold's summary of what's the issue. And I think the people in the audience would be very interested to hear your perspective on all of this, and what private sector, as a let's say as a speaker for private sector, what are the ideas? What are you thinking about this whole? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much for including Trimble, and we're honored, and I'm honored to represent, and hopefully I can continue the conversations, all the wonderful ideas and plans and thoughts that we've all heard in this call so far. So thank you very much. I'll say from the private industry perspective, in contributing to the approach to such a complex challenge with so many different stakeholders and inputs and objectives, each with their own unique set of requirements. Private industry must, and I know Trimble feels this way, we must be partners with worldwide leaders such as the UN-GGIM and other industry leaders such as Building Smart initiatives to try to work towards providing scale of connectivity, accessibility, productivity with technologies to meet customers and users and contributors where they're at today, but also where they want and where we all can collectively go in the future. So it's not like private industry necessarily versus public or other institutions. We must work together to do this, and I know Trimble feels this way. So I would say where to me the webinar started off great with Leslie's slide on the data into information and knowledge, because that's where we as a technology, hardware and software provider look to take our customers, and I know others in the same space do the same thing. We're trying to turn all of this rapidly growing and changing information or data into actions, into information and into knowledge, with both human knowledge as well as machine knowledge and connectivity there. So I would say throughout connectivity, so we're looking at things on common data environments and making data accessible through easier access models for both online or offline connected users. These are all very large challenges. The one thing that Trimble and others can provide is additional productivity. So what we're focused on, and I know others in the industry are as well, is to be able to reduce costs of our users through being able to do more with what you have. This is all sounds well and good, but macroeconomic factors such as increasing labor shortages or the aging workforce of geospatial professionals, being able to do more with technology and leveraging tools such as artificial intelligence, but also to do it more safely as well, right? Where you'd be able to put in a machine or a robot into an environment where to avoid putting human life at risk in certain situations and certain applications. So where I see and where Trimble sees is both sort of as a response to customers and public agencies and initiatives such as what we've discussed in this webinar, but also being more proactive with those new technological applications to drive towards these common goals. The last bit, and this was great, both Deidre and David spoke about this, is in terms of ecosystems and trying to define, I really liked what David said about trying to define what an ecosystem actually is or looks like. From applications and some specific examples that Trimble has been involved in, there's not going to be a single ecosystem. So the need to be more interconnected, to be more open with standards is something that I've seen firsthand from the likes of Trimble and Esri and Autodesk. Is something that we as industry partners are moving towards, and being able to collect data with a certain vendor's hardware and then move that data through into processing software, and then ultimately the system of record or wherever that data is going to reside to be accessed by all of the stakeholders. Proprietary file formats are hopefully going away, and we hope to take a leading position in that, where it's more focused on the data and the data connections, and where that data can resolve or can reside to be more and more accessible. So a key takeaway for me is from an industry perspective is very much aligned with some of these challenges that have been discussed. Is like, well, what is the system? What is the system going to look like? Well, it's really a system of systems, as was mentioned throughout. And so, being able to be a partner in that activity, both from Trimble's perspective, but others as well, as we move towards this goal of making data and information and knowledge more accessible, more connected, and more productive with the tools that we have and we will continue to develop. So yeah, thank you very much for including Trimble, and I'm happy to represent the company.
Okay, thank you very much. When I look at all the different interventions and also some of the questions that have been going around in the chat, I think if I may summarize, we see the geospatial ecosystem as being an environment where man and machine interact without everything going through one door, but like the slides that Leslie showed, a very large network of interactions, where the biggest difference for us is comparing to the SDI is that we made an SDI so people could see what data we have, and now we have to shift into whatever you want to call it, geospatial ecosystem, where machines will talk to the data and try to find the data they want to use to go from information, from data to information to wisdom, like it was said at a certain point. And I think that's a very interesting challenge. And the question for us as UN-GGIM is not how are we going to make this work, because this is not, it is far beyond the reach. The question I think we have to answer is, do we have to, as governments, do we have to have a hand in there? And how can we make sure this is going in a direction which we collectively think is beneficial to the citizens and to the sustainable development of the world? And so I don't know if anybody has been looking at the meeting chat to see whether there are any questions that we can pop up to our panel.
Ingrid, I'm happy to answer the question that came in before about those implementing the IGIF.
Okay, please.
Mm-hmm. Right now, we know formally through formal UN-GGIM processes, like the IGIF Development Account Project, activities with the World Bank, Cart for Cat, and most recently with the SDG Data Alliance, just around 40 countries are formally implementing the IGIF. We also know that other countries are doing this on their own. For example, Germany developed their own country-level action plan. We have engaged most recently with over 20 countries in the Caribbean, and they are exploring the process through a series of workshops. As we prepare for the 13th session of UN-GGIM Committee of Experts, we're planning to prepare a full list of when and how the countries we know are going about this. So stay tuned for more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deidre. This is very, let's say, I'm getting enthusiastic about those numbers because it's a lot of countries already using this. And just to be clear to some people in the audience who are maybe not aware of the full details of the UN of the IGIF. The IGIF is a framework approach, so a country can assess where am I in the in my geospatial ability and what actions can I take to improve. So it's really about governments improving the geospatial awareness and the geospatial readiness of their country. And I see in the chat some people saying, well, private sector should be more involved, or the non-for-profit organizations should be more involved. And this is, of course, depends on the country level, but it is, of course, necessary that initiatives, NGO or private sector initiatives, are acknowledged and are used, because in this geospatial ecosystem, there is no exclusivity to anybody, because everybody can talk to everybody. And the importance is that as a government, we know how to somehow manage it. And we've seen the discussions over the last weeks in Europe about the ethics of artificial intelligence and how to deal with that. And so that's where governments sometimes have to step in and regulate. But I think in the geospatial ecosystem, this is also where we have to make sure that governments are aware of what's happening and that they know where they have to step up and make an impact so that things go for the better of society. Okay, let's see if there are some questions about how private sector can what other frameworks are available for implementing geospatial ecosystem. Well, we are working within UN-GGIM. We are working on several frameworks, and we can share a slide maybe later about how the IGIF, the FELA, which is the framework for effective land administration, we also work on the geodesy. So we are working on different aspects of geospatial with specific frameworks. We also have the framework for disaster risk reduction and some others. So I'm sure if you browse around the UN-GGIM website, you will find all the details about that. That's for the people who are asking that question in the chat. So somebody asks, do we work with SALB? I think you mean the administrative data. Of course, it's part of the geospatial data that is managed at the UN level, and where the United Nations GGIM member states are involved in providing authoritative data to that data set. Now, I see Leslie has been set up as a for some comments. So please, Leslie, I'm sure you have followed the chat. It's not so easy for me to manage everything. So please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for that. Look, there's some exciting questions actually, and some that really interest me, and that's the one around trust and the ethics around data. So I just to try and answer firstly the question about how you can how we can help people to understand the trust in our data, and really the machines, when they process data, they need to know the provenance of the data. So in the future, our metadata needs to be machine readable as well as our data. And so that will be a key future activity when we talk about the actions we need to take as countries in moving from our current SDIs to future SDIs. Machine readable data will be one of those actions. Machine can interpret things around consistency and timeliness and the accuracy of the data. And of course, machine readable data, when we talk about fair data, there are standards of how that has to be encoded so that it is machine readable. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that there are multiple data sets on the web, and how do we know which one's right? And look, one of my students, and I'd like to share her name, Fian Yu, just got her PhD 2 weeks ago looking at this aspect. She looked at how do you determine which points of interest data set is accurate for asking questions? And so what my answer is there's research to be done in this area. So she looked at 5 data sets, all the same types of points of interest, and she spoke with humans, she spoke with people and said, well, how would you determine which point you would keep in the data set and which attributes you would keep? And so she programmatically, using semantic web technologies, which is a Web 3.0 technologies, developed a methodology to do that and come up with a definitive answer. So these algorithms have to incorporate these processes for us to start to be able to trust those answers and that the data is actually the correct data. Because when we think about how many data sets are out there, particularly now global data sets, with Google Maps, OpenStreetMap, and now Overture Maps, and which data is right? Which should I be using? So I think there's some processes, and this is where I think we need to embrace the research community. And someone noted, I think earlier in the chat, that there is a need to have a research strategy so that we're all working together towards this ecosystem to define it. I mean, we are geospatial people and we can't let others define how these processes work. This is our knowledge domain and we know what to do. The other one is, so how do we communicate that trust? And that's something I've not seen done. So if you think about when you book a hotel, you know if it's a 2-star or 5-star, and you're likely to understand what it is. When you look at Tim Berners-Lee puts out is data semantic web ready. It's a 5-star model, and you can attribute that to your data. How do we do that to data? How do we propose that's authoritative data? And there's an excellent paper coming out at the next UN-GGIM meeting, and that's around authoritative data, and it touches on things like this. How do we communicate what is authoritative and what isn't, so that when the data is analysed and an answer produced, how do we communicate that easily to the user? Yeah, we need to think about this. So I think these are great questions. Panos, particularly asking lots of questions there. I don't have all the answers. We just know that there are means out there, but they are not mainstream. And this is something I think that the committee perhaps may wish to consider addressing. So thank you, Ingrid. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. And as you say, we see a lot of people asking very detailed questions. We cannot answer all of them in this seminar. I see one question, one suggestion is that somehow we upload the details of the information you managed or the studies. Okay, I will now switch to David, who also wants to come to comment on some of the questions or remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid. And I realise we're approaching the end, so I'll be quite quick. I just wondered how perhaps we can think about towards our meeting this August and just some practical steps that we could take. And I think something I've just heard today, I guess, from a range of different speakers and also just reading some of the questions also, is just trying to think about what practical steps that we can take to link our work to the development of our external environment, let's call that the global ecosystem for a second, and work both ways. So I guess I quite like it when I can see a sort of set of principles that I can sign up to, or assumptive statements that I can believe in. And I just wonder how helpful it might be to be able to articulate the bridge, if you like, between the great work that Leslie is talking about, and relate that back to what practical things it means for GGIM. And I think someone had made a really helpful statement earlier on in the conversation online, which was less about whether it's proactive or reactive, but just what action do we believe that we take. And so I wonder whether we could have a conversation that's based around identifying some principles that we should then respond to through the IGIF and other frameworks, principles whereby we seek to influence other stakeholders, whether those are in government, whether those are in technology, to try and ensure that the value of our work has greatest impact. And maybe as an illustration or as the example of perhaps where some of us have started to do that is through the work of taking climate action. A number of us presented quite a bit on that last year. Some of the delegates online today participated within the Cambridge conference about 12 months ago. We also use climate as one of the, or taking climate action as one of the major themes at the World Geospatial Information Congress last year in Hyderabad. And I wonder whether we could continue to use taking climate action as one of the sort of really important lines of the SDGs, that we can demonstrate how our work is directly evolving to support and develop the ecosystem that is now taking place and evolving and coming to place around climate action, climate mitigation, and how we are involved in that in some way to make it practical and to make it more of, if you like, a case study. That would be my concluding thought. Thank you.
Okay, well, and with that concluding thought, we have come to the end of the time we had allocated to this seminar. I know a lot of people will be disappointed because they have still interesting thoughts or questions. I would like to thank you all for your very active involvement, and I'm sorry we couldn't get more deeper into all your questions. If you have, if you have more thoughts or whatever, share them with us through the Secretariat, because last year in our meeting in New York, we decided we should discuss this, and further on through the year, we did not get a lot of discussion. So thanks for taking this up now, and thank you for working on this topic. Any ideas you have, we would be very happy if you could share them in the following days with the Secretariat, because we need to prepare for our meeting in August, and this is a very short time between now and August, given the process of translation and discussion and meeting with the Bureau on how to present the results of our work. So please share this, and I want to thank you all. I want to thank our speakers, and I wish you all a very pleasant rest of the day. Thank you very much. See you in New York.